you bring people who look like me onto campus to be visibly brown or black and to staff DEI committees and to do particular kinds of minority work, right? And if they're a great scholar, awesome.
One of your students had been involved in an attempted lynching, I believe was the phrase.
Yes. All of the problems in this country related to racism's past remain. Academics are now mostly the equivalent of Uber drivers, except with the particular misfortune of needing to find a new place, a new state to work in every year or two as they bounce from job to job.
Over the past decade or so, if you wanted to find the hottest front in America's culture wars, you just had to visit a college campus. There were the speech codes and the diversity statements, the campus protests, the affirmative action showdowns, speakers getting disinvited, and the professors getting canceled over statements that would seem unobjectionable to most of the population, like, there are two biological sexes. There has been no shortage of material for a columnist looking for topics. One of the stranger consequences of that is that some of the people who've become most skeptical of universities are people who once believed in them the most. Tyler Austin Harper is one of those people. Tyler's a staff writer at The Atlantic, and until recently, he was a professor at Bates College. He arrived there with what he calls a kind of missionary faith in higher education. He believed colleges served the public good, and he wanted to be part of that. And then he spent 5 years inside it. In his September cover story for The Atlantic, Confessions of a Token Black Professor, Harper writes about the experiences that gradually changed his mind. For one thing, being treated as a racial token, and watching DEI rhetoric collide with the treatment of adjunct faculty, and seeing institutions that talked constantly about justice, yet seemed strangely uninterested in their most basic mission of educating students. Tyler and I disagree about plenty. I'm a libertarian and he's a democratic socialist. But we found a surprising amount of common ground about what universities have become and what we've lost along the way, and whether a system this troubled might finally be troubled enough to change. Tyler, welcome to the show. All right, so we are going to start off with just a little biography. Tell me, you grew up outside of Harrisburg, I believe?
Yes, Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. A good place to live, as the town motto ran. The other notable person from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, is the comedian Shane Gillis. We are the two proud exports of Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania.
Wow, and you were like almost the same age, yeah? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, right around the same age, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you know him in high school?
I did not. No, I know people who knew him, but no.
So tell me about your family.
Yeah, my biological father split when I was very young. My mom got remarried when I was about 9 or 10. My adoptive father is a police officer, a state police officer for many years, recently retired. And so I think my politics and my perhaps slightly unorthodox or heterodox, a word I hate, I suppose, take on American life and culture comes in part from having come from a family that on my mother's side was from West Virginia, very, very poor, believed very strongly in higher education, but also had a thoroughly sort of blue-collar background, at least until I went to college.
And your mother is white and your father is black, is that correct?
Biological father, yes, is black, correct.
Biological father.
Yep.
I think, we're going to be talking about race, class, and education today. So tell me about your experience in education. You go to public schools in Mechanicsburg?
Yes. Yep. I went to Cumberland Valley High School, public school in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, which was a extraordinarily colorblind place for the most part, I would say. I think there was a real sense, look, it was not a bastion of diversity in central Pennsylvania, but there was some diversity, and there was basically a sense that what it means to be not a racist is to treat people like people and sort of ignore questions of race. And you absolutely could make the case that perhaps sometimes it was something that should have been talked about more than it was, but there was like certainly a colorblind ethos that to an extent that race wasn't something I thought about very much. It was not a trying experience being a minority in central Pennsylvania in any way, shape, or form. Race wasn't a narrative I sort of problematized in my head. And in fact, it didn't also occur to me that my race would give me any kind of leg up in the college admissions process, actually. I would have applied with the SAT scores I had, I would have applied to different schools than I ended up applying to, though I went to a very good one, had I realized the extent to which, affirmative action benefits minorities. So I was just very naive and blind to the reality of race and class as they intersect in elite institutions, and what race can or cannot do for you and what class can or cannot do for you, mostly cannot. But yeah.
And how did your family think about college? Were your parents always like very much on like, you have to go to college, you have to go to a good college, or were they more laid back and chill about it?
Somewhere in the middle. College was always non-optional. That was always like very clear to me that I would be going to college. Like I said in the article, my family really believed in the value of higher education in a way that I now view as sort of sweet, perhaps misplaced, but sweet. So college was always the thing I was supposed to do and ended up doing. I don't think, though, I spent very little time until I took my SATs and did a lot better than I expected, thinking about where I wanted to go to college. And once I, did the PSATs and SATs, guidance counselors were sort of like, well, with these scores, you could go to these other kinds of schools. And I'd mainly previously been thinking I would go to Penn State. I loved Penn State football. And so that was sort of the path I had seen myself as on. But then, just ended up doing better than I anticipated, and realizing a different world of higher education was open for me than the one I planned on, and ended up at Haverford College outside of Philadelphia.
Where you fell in love with literature.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And had you expected, like I was the kid who like wrote a novel. I mean, not a very good one, to be clear.
But 8. You did it.
I did it in my little black and white composition books. Were you that kid who had just always loved reading and always wanted to be around books and doing something with books? Or was that a late discovery for you?
No, I had always been a voracious and obsessive reader, even before I got to college. I think when I got to college, though, is when that really became turbocharged for a number of reasons. One is that I took a very excellent class with the Renaissance scholar, Catherine Rowe, who I now believe is the president of William and Mary. So, Catherine, if you happen to be listening, you taught a great course on Milton my freshman year, which I took at nearby Bryn Mawr College. But I did quite poorly in that course. I mean, not poorly. I got a B, but I got a B on some papers. And I was so frustrated because I was like, somehow these kids I'm in this class with came in to college knowing how to write like an advanced sort of research paper, right? And I very much did not. And so initially I was kind of motivated by spite, whereas I'm a very competitive person. I was like, the next time I'm in an English class, I'm going to be the best student in the class. So I spent that whole summer reading everything I could get my hands on. I read Ulysses, all sorts of French theory and other sorts of famously difficult texts, because I was very determined, again, largely out of spite, that I would figure this thing out. And gradually I came to realize that, this seemed like a good way to live. Like, I looked at the lives my professors had. They taught young people to love literature and books. They had what seemed to me an enviable amount of free time to consider questions that were important and interesting to them. They were kind of edgy in a way, right? Where I had this sense, and that was the real awakening I had in college, particularly early in college. I had always loved reading, but I had this sense that, like, oh, books can be edgy and expand your vistas and expose you to ideas that somebody from a smaller town in central Pennsylvania wasn't previously exposed to. And that was all very intoxicating. But I also felt that I've never been somebody that I think would be comfortable in a kind of office setting, and I was like, this seems like a good job for me. And so I decided really early on I wanted to go straight from Haverford to a Ph.D. program. And yeah, it just sort of clicked very early that I wanted in academic life.
So you go and you get your Ph.D. And tell me about that experience a little bit.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. I think there was a bit of culture shock, in part because I had entered an environment that was where people were not regularly bowled over by the fact that someone was paying them to read, right? Like, I was just stunned by the fact that not only was I able to get my PhD for free, but they in fact pay you to be there and essentially just take courses and read books. Grad students love to complain. And I remember arriving and feeling like everyone is acting like this is a prison and someone's actually paying us. Not a lot, but some amount of money, thanks, better than many places, thanks to NYU's great union, but to sit around and read books. And so, there was a part of it that I mean, even thinking back, I still, it's, if you come from a working class background, it's kind of hard to imagine that's an experience people get to have. But I was really well supported at NYU. A lot of people don't have an easy time in grad school, I'll be the first to say, but I was lucky that I had really good mentors. I was, encouraged to follow my interests wherever they went. I did have a taste pretty early, I think, of the kind of academic hypocrisy I'd encounter later. I was at NYU during the Avato Ronell years, if people are familiar with that story, where this was sort of in the Me Too era, where a female professor, a philosopher who's very famous, was accused of some behavior that I will politely describe as unscrupulous. And I really watched a lot of people who I knew better and who I knew about the situation, and knew that there was something to the accusations being made, pretend that they knew nothing about it, and rally to her defense, essentially because she was a important and famous member of the program, right? And she was very good for the complet program at NYU, and so there was a bit of a circling the wagons. And so early on, that was a kind of experience where I was like, oh, well, there are these people who identify as leftists and progressives and so on and so forth. But when push comes to shove, they will defend their class interests and the interests of their institution over and above grad students who might be vulnerable and vulnerable to, being taken advantage of in certain ways. So, but largely my experience was great, even if at times it was eye-opening.
And so then you get the holy grail. You get a tenure track job at Bates. And tell me about that. Tell me about, and you get it right before the pandemic. You write in this essay, I had not realized this, that you literally signed your letter like right before lockdown.
Yes.
And
yes.
So you missed the pandemic. You did not miss the pandemic closures, but you missed the pandemic hiring freezes and so forth. And you go to Lewiston, Maine, and you talked about having a kind of missionary zeal for what you were doing. And what were you a missionary for? What are the tenets of your faith at this point?
Well, I mean, I had to use the word transformative college experience. That's the kind of thing they put on pamphlets, right? I had just come through this research institution that is NYU, that in many ways was a very good place to be, but in other ways is the embodiment of the corporate university model, right? Whereas Haverford, with its Quaker ethos and its very tiny tombstones on the nearby campus graveyard, because Quakers believe in modesty above all else, seemed to embody like a different kind of ethos that I associated with small liberal arts colleges. And so I really believed in that idea of small classes, of being at an institution that was committed to educating all kinds of students, not just the wealthy, although I certainly had plenty of wealthy students, but also, for example, local working class kids from Maine that were not dissimilar to me when I was growing up. And I believed that. Like, I believed that colleges were places that mostly serve the public good. I was not naive to the fact that they had problems from rising tuition to whatever else, but I more or less believed that these kinds of institutions were a net positive for society and that they were a place that do make the world better, even as they, of course, have their problems.
So how do they make the world better? By improving income mobility, by spreading the love of learning, by doing research? What are I assume those are three things on your list, but are there others?
No, those would have been the big ones, I think. The sense that, look, one of the amazing things I think about this country is that we have a university system that is both public and private, but predicated on the idea of mass education, right? Like, it is actually a miracle that there are small colleges in rural Maine. And it is a miracle that there are land-grant universities in Nebraska and Wisconsin, et cetera, right? That is not something you can take for granted in terms of the educational situation in other places. And I really believed, and there's part of me that still believes it, although to a much lesser extent, I really believe that that's one of the best things about this country, right? That there are places students can go, yes, for job preparation, and yes, to give them an advantage in the marketplace, et cetera, but also to learn things that might not be terribly useful, but that are important and that are part of being an educated citizen, and that are also, and I think this was a big part of the appeal to me, it's about becoming immersed in a culture that precedes you. Right, that there is this long and unbroken chain of intellectualism, Western intellectualism in particular, but not only, dating back millennia to the time of the ancient Greeks or whatever, and that we inherit this tradition, and that what a college does is keep that lamplight of intellectual culture going and then transmitting it to the next generation. And I think that stuff's important. And I quickly discovered that the educational mission, at least at the college I was at, did not seem to be the top priority above other sorts of things that were going on campus.
Hey, y'all. Do you realize it has been 9 months since we launched this podcast? I can't believe it either. I still remember back when we were thinking about starting this and how kind of terrifying it was. I mean, exciting as heck. I had an idea that I was really going to like talking to amazing guests and also interacting with my listeners. You guys have been emailing, sending me DMs on Twitter, and I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to know that you've been enjoying this too. But I still do remember how frightening it was and how lucky I was to have the amazing team of producers who held my hand through the process and helped me learn how to do this. And I am so glad looking back that I decided to take that leap. Even though I was scared, I thought, like, am I going to be any good at this? Will anyone want to listen? And then I just thought, you know what? There's only one way to find out. So I did. If you've been sitting on a business idea, it might be time for you to find out too. But you're going to need a team with you. And that's what Shopify is. Shopify makes it easy to make it happen. Everything you need to start selling is included and ready from day one, including the moment your first customer is ready to pay. Shopify Checkout helps more of them finish their purchase, which means more of them doing business with you, putting the money in the business that you're going to need to grow it. And when they come back, their details are already saved. One tap and they're done. Because Shopify handles the setup and checkout, you have more time to think about other things, about delighting your customers and making the business grow. Shopify powers millions of businesses worldwide, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to small businesses just getting started like maybe yours. With Shopify, nothing stands between your idea and a real business. So guys, there's only one way to find out. You got an idea for a business? Go make it one. Start your free trial at shopify.com/Megan. That's shopify.com/Megan. So we should pause to mention that in your 20s, I assume in grad school, or was this in college, you became a socialist?
Yes, I was a socialist from my early 20s. I had a brief phase as a Maoist, although not in a particularly enthusiastic one, but nonetheless. But yes, I've been a socialist since my early 20s. I'd probably reasonably describe myself as a democratic socialist with Marxist, though not orthodox or revolutionary Marxist sympathies. Right, I'm not in favor of a dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever. But I do think Marxism gives a good account, one that certainly influenced how I ended up thinking about academia, of how ideas come to govern particular kinds of institutions and why some values and ideas win out over others. But yes, I am a card-carrying leftist, although one not always in good standing, depending on who you ask.
I'm a card-carrying libertarian who is also not in good standing with my movement, so we will have a lot to talk about, and I'm sure a lot to argue about. I will ask, actually, do you think there is an irony? Because I think that the American university system is the best in the world, bar none. And it's best in the world, not just on like when you look at rankings of research and so forth and Nobel Prizes. It's the best in the world because it does offer such a variety of experiences, because it's open to so many different kinds of people in different ways. I remember talking to a labor economist about system, which is really admired by a lot of people. And he said, yeah, in many ways it's great. And also when you're 16, your life course is decided and there's not really a way to get back if you don't, we have a very flexible and also luxurious, and the quality at the top is incredible. Do you think there's a little bit of an irony that system exists in the most capitalist country in the world?
Yes and no. I think there is some irony, but I think for much of the history of the American Academy, the American university system has operated as a kind of countervailing power, not in the sense that it's a place of leftist indoctrination, but a place where learning for the sake of learning is prioritized, and where not everything is submitted to this kind of utilitarian calculus where I'm doing X so that I can get Y job and make Z salary, right? And I think over the course of the 20th and 21st century, that changed, right? And the American university system, in many ways, still kept its very high quality, and there are still fantastic scholars and professors to be found all over this country at those universities, and you can still get a quality education in many places, although I think AI is changing that somewhat. But I do think that universities used to be a kind of island within the broader landscape of American capitalism, and that island has been more recently connected by various bridges to the mainland. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, I think that's obviously correct that the university has moved more towards its function as a job certificate rather than, say, it's 1900, we're doing Bordeauxian class formation, and
Right.
your son is born and you put him down for Groton and Harvard, if you're a certain class of person. But I mean, the flip side of that, right, is there's a lot more money going in. So my dad was a professor briefly before he decided that he didn't want to teach political science. He wanted to go do politics. But, in that, he is getting hired in the vast expansion that happens basically in the 1940s to 60s as the baby boom is growing up and getting educated. And it was like the price of that was that it did become a job certificate, right?
Yes.
Was that as you put more people in, you're not doing class formation, or are doing class formation, but not in the same way. You're not doing technical training the way like the, Colorado School of Mines was doing. That it's starting to take on different functions in society. And one of those is that we expect it to form the middle class for us. And that comes with a lot of benefits for professors, right? It means that for at least the baby boomers and the generation that like the early Xers, there are a lot of jobs and a lot of money going into research, and they are doing much less. They have to do less teaching than they were at especially at the big research schools, right? In fact, a lot of a professor got a lot better in a lot of ways because of that trade. So was it a net bad trade?
I think it was a net bad trade for American intellectual life. I think, particularly within the humanities and social sciences, I think the trade has been largely, from a somewhat outside, but not entirely outside observer, more favorable for folks in the sciences where there's been more research support, institutional support, federal support, et cetera. But for the humanities in particular, I'm not sure that trade has been especially worth it. I think they have been... Look, when the university becomes a credentialing bureaucracy, which I think we can all agree that's what it is, right? And when its primary telos becomes not learning for the sake of learning or class formation or whatever number of things, more or less positive, you might want to say about its previous sets of purposes. But when it becomes about entry into the market and about securing respectable middle and upper middle class salaries, then it is hard for the humanities to compete in that landscape, right? Because you are not the economics department where you can say, well, if you major in economics, we can put you into these career pathways that are going to pay pretty well. Humanities can't really say that. So they end up needing to make some kind of utilitarian bargain, which really ends up being, over the course of the 20th, but particularly the 21st century, a bargain around morality and politics, right? Where like actually what the humanities do is teach you to be a good person, right? It's not that we're steeping you in this grand tradition that stretches back to Socrates, but it's that we're going to prepare you to be a politically savvy and morally upright kind of individual, right? Because some utilitarian case had to be made, because like why else pay for this particular kind of degree, right? And I'm not sure that's been good for the culture of the humanities in this country. I'm not sure if it's been good for the quality of scholarship. I'm not sure if it's been good for the kinds of questions and problems and ideas that humanists tend to explore. I think there are things that will be lost if the humanities migrate back out of the American university system. There's kinds of work that can only be done with university support. If you are an archivist who works on the Renaissance or something, and you need a lot of institutional support to fly to Cambridge to go through their dusty old archives, and that requires money and plane tickets and this and that, yes, there's something about the university system that is irreplaceable to the kind of knowledge you're trying to produce. But if you are in other sorts of humanities fields, if you're a literary scholar who's not working in archives, or if you're a philosopher or whatever, I'm not sure that the bargain has actually been that good. And in fact, I think one can make a very reasonable case that rehousing the humanities in particular in the university system has been a net negative, and that there are ways in which they were healthier before the advent of the modern research university. I'm sure some people wouldn't agree with that, but I think it's a defensible position to at least put on the table.
I have some quarrels with the way that the humanities have ended up modeled on the kind of German research university model, which I think works very well for science and is not really a great way to approach like teaching literature. But if we get into that, we will be here all day, and you may have things you want to do. So I'm going to go back to your story of Bates. So you get there. And I also want to, before we go there, you were basically a supporter of affirmative action when you arrived.
Yes, for sure.
And then your experience at Bates shifts that. So can you tell people how that transformation happened?
Yeah, I came in supporting affirmative action in the sense that I think there's a real case to be made that the legacy of racism in this country, and I will use the progressive phrase, institutional racism, that there are long tail effects from these policy and other kinds of decisions that were made in the 19th and 20th century, and that there's a case to be made that in order to rectify some of those lasting inequalities from historical epochs in American life, that yes, you should give somewhat of a leg up to minorities, particularly Black Americans. Now, my sense of that coming in was that is the equivalent of if you have an A- candidate who is Black and an A candidate who is white, you hire the A- Black candidate because you might say, well, this is a person who might not have come from money, who might have, was a first generation college student, maybe had a hard time adjusting, or unlike somebody who grew up in a family of college graduates, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a case to be made that although their CV might be slightly less polished than the A candidate, it's defensible to hire them, right, for reasons of historical inequality. I believed in that kind of case, and I assumed that is largely what was going on in American colleges and universities. Look, I was not naive to the fact that when I applied to Bates and other colleges that my race gave me a leg up. I was also not naive to the fact that when I was hired, that I'm almost certain there were probably more qualified candidates than I was. And that is not a dig. I think my academic trajectory was a perfectly respectable one and was more than qualified for the job. So it's not self-deprecation. It's just an acknowledgement of reality that when you have a surfeit of PhDs on the job market, many of whom have been out for several years looking for work, and in that time they've been publishing, doing postdocs, doing visiting assistant professor positions. When I applied to that job, there were almost certainly people who had published a book, who had an impressive postdoc, who had lots of teaching experience simply by virtue of the fact that they had been teaching and weren't in grad school. And so I knew when I got the job fresh out of grad school, which is increasingly rare these days, that it was definitely my race had been a factor. But I was not particularly stressed about that. As I said, that is just that is the way affirmative action works, and in my view is a defensible way for it to work. But over my time at Bates, it increasingly became apparent to me that affirmative action is a policy that depends in large part on judgment, right? And it depends on good judgment. And what affirmative action says, and at least in my view, tacitly, right, is that we need to accept very slightly, ideally, very slightly different standards for minority candidates and non-minority candidates for all the reasons I just mentioned. But what is a slightly different standard is a judgment call, right? And so you end up in situations where actually the standards can feel like they're a little more different than just slight, right? And I began feeling over the course of my time at the college that there was a sense that we need diversity for the sake of diversity, that the reason people like me are on campus is to advance the college's diversity goals. It's to be a scholar or an educator second, if at all. And there were instances, I described one in the piece where I was on a hiring committee and there were two minority candidates, one who was brilliant and an academic rock star, and the other one who was, her work was, to be polite, not good. Somebody in her rough area of expertise described it as her research is 50 years out of date, but she had DEI and other related experiences and was also a person of color, and she ended up emerging as the preferred candidate, right? So it was not as though people were unaware that you could have like very high quality minority candidates. We had one in that search, but it was that is not the most important thing, right? That you bring people who look like me onto campus to be visibly brown or Black, and to advance and to staff DEI committees and to do particular kinds of minority work, right? And if they're a great scholar, awesome. But if they're not, well, I mean, is that really why we're bringing them on board in the first place? Maybe not. And so it really changed how I viewed the case for affirmative action in practice, if not in theory. Because in theory, all of the problems in this country related to racism's past remain. But in practice, as you sort of said earlier, it is not clear to me that there's insofar as we need to rely on imperfect human judgment, there's a way to actually enact that at the policy level that doesn't cause more harm than good, including more harm than good to minorities.
And that goes more broadly, I think, for DEI, which I assume, again, going in, you're like, yeah, we should be trying to make our campus a more welcoming place for people. And yes, we should, if people do racist things, we should stop them. You had a really striking incident where early on in your career at Bates, a colleague emails you to tell you that one of your students had been involved in an attempted lynching, I believe was the phrase.
Yes.
Can you tell that story?
So I got an email the summer after my first year saying that one of my students had been involved in an attempted lynching. I was not the only person on this email, but I was one of the people on it. And as I read, so immediately I was very confused because the student in question was an extremely progressive person who was very much interested in environmental justice and racial justice, et cetera. So the idea that this was somebody who would be involved in what was, I believe, referred to as a white supremacist incident was immediately confounding to me. And it emerged that there had been an argument between a black student and white students that black student lived with. The argument accelerated to the point where he was asked to leave, and the white student said, if you come back, we'll call the police. I want to be clear that I don't know who was at fault. I don't know if I knew the full details of the situation, whom I might side with. But so setting that aside, right? I don't want to. I'm not trying to suggest these students did nothing wrong or acted maturely in this situation. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I do not know. But the suggestion was made that this threat to call the police whom were not called, as I recall, this threat to call the police constituted an attempted lynching. And the phrase was something along the lines of an attempt to weaponize state power to threaten or kill this black classmate. And I found this preposterous for a number of reasons. One, the professor in question was somebody whose academic work I thought highly of, who's a smart and serious person, so not a wacko. So I felt like this was I'm not quite a rock and a hard place, but I was confronted with these two competing things, both of which can't be true. One is that this person I think is smart and interesting and does good academic work is claiming that one of my students did an attempted lynching. And the other is that this student is somebody who I know to be a progressive kind of person. So one of these two things doesn't add up here. And it was extremely eye-opening because I realized that many of my colleagues were in fact fully untethered from reality. To suggest that this minor incident between students was akin to an attempt to have one of them killed because calling the police is inherently so dangerous to black people, including black people at one of the most expensive liberal arts colleges in the country, that it's tacitly homicidal. And it was one of the first moments where I was like, okay, the culture here is, there's something off.
Why do you think so much of this happened at like small elite liberal arts colleges? I mean, there were many places where stuff like this happened, right? But it was really focused on the elite colleges.
I think it's in part because you were taking faculty, most of whom their backgrounds are upper middle class. They're coming from elite institutions, Harvard, Yale, whatever. You are putting them in often more rural communities in which they're on this small campus and they don't have, or at least they don't feel like they have much sociologically in common with the people in the town they've moved to. So all of their friends and acquaintances, and again, this is a caricature. There are plenty of colleagues I had at Bates who were immersed in the community, whatever. So like but as a general trend, so they gravitate toward one another very understandably. They date and marry one another. All of their friends are other academics, either at that institution or institutions close by. And they develop this kind of bunker mentality where I'm in this essentially hostile territory, where on this little island of progressivism around this sea of rural and perhaps conservative adjacent or fully conservative politics. And I think it creates pressure cookers. I think it's really bad. And I saw this in grad school as well. I think it is really bad when people only associate with people they work with. I think it's bad whether it's in journalism. I think it's bad whether it's probably working construction. I think it's bad when it's academia. But I think the combination of the geographical pressures and also, yes, the sense that a lot of academics think the only kind of life worth living is the academic life. And so they only take other academics seriously, et cetera. And they're just, their assumptions are not tested on the reality outside of their little campus Eden. And I think that's part of why these small colleges tend to be more extreme, I think, than research universities or public universities or universities that are larger and that are more immersed in a community that faculty can imagine themselves as a part of.
So let's talk about what brought you to leave. And I think I DM'd you something at the time to the effect of, are you insane? You have chosen to leave a tenure track job for my unfortunately collapsing industry. So what brought you to that point?
I just felt like all of the things I went into academia to do and that I cared about and that I loved and that had been so central to my own college experience were the parts of the job that were being clubbed to death. I also realized that part of the job when you're on the tenure track and you are management, that's why we're not eligible for your unions because we're part of management, is being a hatchet man who variously ends the careers of contingent professors or that hands out golden tickets to certain job candidates in an industry that is also collapsing. And I just really didn't have the stomach for it. And I had an opportunity to do other things. And I'm not sitting here saying that if I was going to have to go into poverty to leave my academic job, I would have retired or,
Right.
quit on principle. I certainly wouldn't have. But I just think a lot of people around me, as that job was making me increasingly miserable. Most of my friends are not academics. They were like, look, most jobs you can lose, right? Like, because I was like, you can't quit a permanent position. I'm going to get tenure. You can't quit this kind of job. It would be crazy. And they're like, 99.9% of Americans are in jobs that, they'll switch careers. Sometimes you lose jobs, you get laid off, whatever. That's just like a normal part of life that everyone lives with. And I came to realize, like, I had a kind of, which I think most academics have, a sort of Stockholm syndrome, right? Where, look, the problem with academia is that it was once a vocation or a calling. It was something you went into because you wanted a certain kind of life of the mind. It was not because it was the best pathway to making money. And over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st, what was a vocation became a corporate job like any other. And I think the cultural crisis that a lot of academics have is that they still have the mindset that this is a vocation. And they're confronting the reality that it's a corporate job, right? And it's really hard for them to imagine leaving it, right? They don't see it as a job like any other. So I had so many people say, how could you leave the tenure track for the Atlantic? And it's like, how could I leave a college for one of the oldest magazines in the country where I get to write things I want to, like, it's just a job. People switch jobs every day, but academia is a bit of a cult. I think that's overused, and there are certain ways it's not true, but I think there is that sort of cultic edge to it where leaving academia is like leaving the mafia or something that people just can't compute.
So your piece in The Atlantic, which is great and which everyone needs to read if you have not read it already, you tie together these two threads. On the one hand, there is the kind of disillusionment about the priority that is being placed, like partly that it's pigeonholing you into doing race work.
Yes.
Right? You tell a story about how the university is doing this report that's going to require everyone to take classes in their major
on white supremacy, colonialism,
on white supremacy, right? So let's decolonize physics, and that's half of it, and then the other half is this disillusionment with the unionization, with the other stuff. Which of those threads should I think was the primary and which was the secondary? The A plot and the B plot, as it were.
I think, look, I have a lot of flaws as a person. I'm sure there are people enumerating them on Twitter right now. But I just have no
Blue
stomach.
sky, Tyler. Blue sky. Twitter loves your. Twitter loves your.
Yeah, Blue sky does not. but I really don't have a stomach for hypocrisy. I've always been that way. I have plenty of other flaws, and maybe I'm excessively critical of what I see as hypocrisy. But I don't have a stomach for it. And I think if it were just the racial tokenization, like that is what it is, right? Like, I mean, Bates was the place I experienced that most acutely, but there are other times in grad school or elsewhere where, like, I remember being told I shouldn't write my thesis on Joyce. I should think about Langston Hughes or something like that, right? Like, so there are, it wasn't the first time, and I found it extremely annoying. And so there were parts of the tokenization that were extremely dispiriting and frustrating, especially when I had other interests and things I cared about in education. You constantly find yourself being asked on to staff various diversity committees. And to be fair to the college and the people who make those decisions, I will point out that is a rock in a hard place in the 2020s, right? Like, I got put on the MLK Junior Committee. But on the flip side of that coin, even as I resented that kind of tokenization, if they had put a white person there, people would have been pissed because they would have said, why is there a white person in charge of MLK Day? So there are these, the culture in these progressive spaces has been distorted in such a way that the choices are between, like, a certain kind of tokenization in which you get called racist, or a not tokenizing and putting white people in charge of things that might relate to minorities, and then you get called racist for doing that, right? So I appreciate that can be a bind. But as frustrating as that all was, it really was the fountain of social justice rhetoric constantly emanating from the college at the same time that they were hiring union busters or who were, churning through various contingent professors that I worked with who were not on the tenure track, who were beloved by students, who were doing great work, and they get the axe. And then being put in this position on hiring committees where you are constantly, again, just functioning as a hatchet man within a broken job market where everybody is acculturated to chase this dream, right? To next year's the year, right? You didn't get the jobs this year. You're going to be a temporary professor for another year, but next year, maybe there'll be something in your field. And before you know it, you're 40 years old and you are a freeway flyer teaching at 4 different universities because they cap the number of courses you teach because otherwise they'd have to give you healthcare. And needing to function as management in that landscape, I just found disgusting. And maybe I could have handled it. A lot of jobs are like that. Look, a lot of jobs in America, you have to do ugly things you don't want to do. And maybe I could have stomached that in the same way that I could have maybe stomached the tokenization, were it not for the fact that everyone was breathlessly insisting that we are that sublime force which bends the arc of the universe toward justice. And I think that just became too much, and it was making me miserable. And like I said, I wasn't going to starve. I had managed to cobble together a freelance writing career by that point. And so I was like, I don't have to keep doing this, and I don't want to.
You know what I love, y'all? I love a long, lazy weekend day in bed. You know why I can't have what I love? Because my circadian rhythms are extremely attuned to light. And the minute that dawn starts peeking her rosy fingers through my windows, I am awake. So I have been thinking about getting some blackout blinds. Problem is, that means that on that long, lazy weekend day I want to have, I got to get up. Luckily, there is a better way to buy blinds, shades, shutters, and drapery, and it is called 3-Day Blinds. They're the leading manufacturer of high-quality custom window treatments in the US. And right now, if you use my URL, 3dayblinds.com/optimistic, they are running a buy one, get 50% off deal. Best of all, you can shop for them from the bed or the couch or wherever else you would rather be than some strip mall out on the edge of your city. 3-Day Blinds has local, professionally trained design consultants who have an average of 10 plus years of experience that provide expert guidance to find the right blinds for you in the comfort of your home. Just set up an appointment and you'll get a free, no obligation quote the same day. And look, DIY projects can be fun, but measuring and installing blinds, that's kind of a big deal. The expert team at 3-Day Blinds handles all that heavy lifting. They design, measure, and install so you can sit back, relax, and leave it to the pros. I mean, I've been looking at their Instagram. I gotta tell you, they got some nice looking stuff. And not only that, they have all of these fancy options like mechanical blinds. They have blinds that are integrated with your Alexa. You know, like I run a lot of things through our Alexa now, but I never thought that I could get my blinds connected to Alexa too. So I don't even have to get out of my bed on Saturday morning. When I actually am awake, I can just say, Alexa, open the blinds each morning. Well, with 3-day blinds, you choose from thousands of options that fit any budget or style. They have helped over 2 million people get the window treatments of their dreams, so they are a brand you can trust. Right now, get quality window treatments that fit your budget with 3-day blinds. Head to 3dayblinds.com/optimistic for their buy one, get one 50% off deal on custom blinds, shades, and drapery. For a free, no charge, no obligation consultation, just head to 3dayblinds.com. That's the number 3dayblinds.com/optimistic. One last time, that's buy one, get one 50% off when you head to the number 3dayblinds.com/optimistic. So let me dive into the economic critique of capitalism, the university, and so forth, and ask, first of all, like Musa Al-Gharbi in his book has We Have Never Been Woke. He is making a kind of intertwined critique. And one question about the ways in which this, what he calls the symbolic capitalists, are going big on identity politics and kind of ignoring the rising inequality in society. Do you think that's, and one way that you can tell that story is like, it's deliberate, is if I do this, I don't have to do that.
Yep.
And the other is that we all have a kind of budget for our self-improvement, social improvement efforts. Some people's budgets are larger than others, but eventually all of us are capped out. And that people are just choosing the path of least resistance, the path that is easiest for them, as people always do, right? Which of those stories do you believe more?
I'm generally pretty hostile toward conspiratorial explanations of institutional dysfunction. I don't think a bunch of senior administrators are sitting around in a smoke-filled room saying, well, you know, if we do all this woke nonsense, then we'll be able to continue exploiting the contingent faculty on campus, and we can crush the labor union and probably get away with it, right? But very few people want to think of themselves as a bad person. I can only think of one person at Bates who I thought was a cynical person who was latched on to social justice as a way to advance their career. And I'm not sure if they believed in it or not. Maybe they did. But in all my time in academia, not just Bates, I've only encountered one person like that. The vast majority were true believers. And I think it's just the path of least resistance, right? And part of the problem is some of these issues are not fixable, right? Like, universities today, colleges, small colleges like I taught at are a little different, but just zooming out a bit. The American higher education system and many institutions of higher learning, they are simultaneously a hospital system, they're a sports franchise, they're a real estate venture, and then they also are an educational apparatus and maybe also a hedge fund. And all of those parts of the business have their own financial incentives, which have very little to do with education and often are actually completely hostile to what you would do to have an educated workforce. So these universities are over leveraged. They're buying tons of real estate. The margins are thinner than you'd think. Then on top of all that, there's massive administrative bloat, right? Those problems aren't that fixable. Lowering tuition without gutting the system as it is pretty difficult, right? And I think a lot of administrators are looking at it and it's like, well, what can we do? We can't really lower sticker price, right? We're not going to sell off the buildings. We can't touch the endowment because if we can touch the endowment, it hurts our U.S. News and World Report ranking. So what can we do? Well, we can emphasize this kind of...
Well, and eventually if you touch the endowment, you run out of endowment, right? You're seeing this now with schools that dipped into the endowment and then that just sort of slightly delayed the decline and then made it happen a lot faster.
A death spiral, yeah. But so I think there was just a calculus like, well, what is something we can do about? Well, we can do something about institutional culture and we can have HR trainings and we can change our syllabi because that is cheap and that is easier to fix than all of these other political economic problems that beset the university system. So I don't think it was evil or scheming. I think it was just a path of least resistance that people didn't even realize at the time, right? Because it allowed them to tell a flattering story about themselves, right? That like, oh, I'm an advocate, I'm an ally, I'm working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm making these elite spaces safer for minorities, right? And who doesn't want to tell that kind of story about themselves?
So let me see if I can tell the story that they might tell about themselves, right? Which is okay. Like, look, everything was imperfect. And as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just said in an interview, woke one was crazy.
I have a local city councilman that has this saying, woke one was crazy.
You talked about the fact that there's repair of the wrong that was done to Black Americans who were enslaved. And that's certainly part of it. And I think if I go back to 1965 through 1975, which is 1980, which is roughly when most of these frameworks are being established, repair is probably the thing people care most about, right? And so they come up with this diversity rationale. But you know what? It's imperfect, but there is a diversity rationale, right? You can make an argument from legitimacy that an institution that is purporting to shape America's elite, not just in jobs, to shape how they think, to shape what they know about the world, maybe not to make them more moral, but to make them think differently, because that is the purpose of a university, or one purpose of a university, is that it needs to be representative, right? It needs to represent both sides, or however many sides, of whatever the salient divides are in your society. In America, race is arguably the most salient divide. It's certainly one. But we're also seeing this with conservatism now. As academia has basically lost all the conservatives, it is undercutting the legitimacy of the institutions in ways that is harmful to parts of their mission that are good, like telling you how vaccines work. And that therefore they need to do some of this stuff, and they need to do all of the stuff that is making you feel annoyed and perhaps marginalized and tolerant of hypocrisy. And that's not about the money part of it. That's just about if it were in a socialist society, it would be the same thing. If it was in any society, it would be the same thing, as long as the elites are based on their kind of cognitive ability, which in the 21st century in a technological society, they are.
I think you need to look back at the history of American higher education, and particularly the history of both the labor system as it intersects with the question of ideological diversity, right? Because I agree, the lack of ideological diversity on campus is a crisis. I think, is it the biggest crisis in higher ed? No, I think tuition and other things, but it is a real...
Not the biggest crisis,
but
I
it is
agree.
a real problem. And it impacts public legitimacy. And it is fine that academia is left-leaning. It's almost always been left-leaning. And there are other kinds of jobs that also have a particular slant, and that is fine. But when you are taking tax dollars from people at universities that increasingly see their mission, or at least did in the recent past, as being akin to a kind of progressive activism, of course you're going to bleed legitimacy, right? But to go back to the 60s and 70s, in the 60s and 70s, in 1975, I believe, there was a report about sort of the politics of American professors, I think called the Divided Academy. And it found that about, I believe, a third of professors were conservatives, a third were moderates, and then 40% were left or liberal, right? So certainly a left liberal slant, but 30% conservatives is a wellspring of ideological diversity compared to what you have now, where on elite campuses that trends from 1 to 9, 10%, and then at some public institutions might be closer to 15%, right? But so that has fallen off, right? We've gone from 30% down to single digits in many institutions. Well, what happens over the course of those decades? The tenure system collapses. The 1960s and 70s were also the high point of the American tenure system, when most American faculty were tenured or on the tenure track and had substantial workplace protections for free speech and free thought. And now we live in a world where a small minority of faculty are tenured on the tenure track. Most are contract employees who have to be worried that if they cause offense, their contract won't be renewed, right? So it is not a mystery, and it is not an accident, and it is not a shock that when you have a workforce that is whose business is truth-telling and has job security, you will have more diversity of thought. You'll have more people saying what they think. You'll have less groupthink. And then when that collapses, of course, you're going to have more groupthink.
So this is where I actually I want to agree with you on this, right? Not because just because it's intuitively a very appealing theory. But I would say a few things. Is that number one, the unions and the people who had workforce protections were not protected. Mm-hmm. right? That tenure, in fact, did not operate super well to protect the people who were targeted during that phase.
McCarthyism and failure.
And so, like, one question I would have is that do workplace protections actually protect in the way that they should when you're in a moral panic? But then the other question is, doesn't tenure actually complicate a lot of the stories you're telling? Doesn't it actually mean because blacks were discriminated against in 1965 when people were coming out of college and becoming professors, you still have professors who are in their 80s and they're all going to be white dudes because of what America looked like 60 years ago. And that is going to change over, but because it changes over so slowly, it puts all of the burden of adjustment on young people. Mm-hmm. And then you get situations like, well, we don't want to have an all-white faculty because we do want to be representative, which means these are the two candidates we have. We need to diversify. This is what we got. Like, doesn't actually some of the stuff that you want economically make some of these other problems harder?
I mean, you could certainly argue that, and I think there's a real problem of, like, look, what I will say is you could wave a wand today and give every American professor tenure, and there would still be a problem of endemic cowardice in academic culture, right? One thing that has been eye-opening my entire, brief career speaking out about higher education, which I started doing when I was at Bates and writing for public outlets, but even just in meetings where I would speak up, I would invariably have people who approach me either in person or via email after saying, thanks for saying something, I wish I could say something. And it's like, you have tenure, you can say something. Like, what is going to happen to you? Like, what are you imagining in your head that is going to happen to you? And clearly what they're imagining is not really that they're going to lose their job, is that they would get yelled at. And they don't want to get yelled at. And they especially don't want to get yelled at when they're in a small college, right? Surrounded by a broader community where, like, the college is their community, right? They don't feel enmeshed in the rest of the social landscape in whatever small town they're in. And so the cowardice problem is real. I don't think better workplace protections would fix everything, but I think it would fix some things. And I think it would have marginal improvements, right? I mean, it's worth noting that, yes, some people got chased out during the Great Awakening, but Amy Wax at Penn, who in my view is a kind of like racist maniac, is still at Penn. There have been attempts to fire her and they can't because she has tenure. And so I really think the labor protections would go a long way to solving some of these problems. They certainly would not solve all of them. They're also endemic cultural problems that need to be dealt with, and professors need to get a spine. Look, it is the great paradox of academia that some of the most protected workers in this country are also some of the most paranoid about speaking up, lest something, again, completely unspecified, bad happen to them.
First of all, when not being able to get fired becomes a big part of the job description, right? You're selecting on risk aversion. You just naturally are. It's true in government jobs too. It's not true and it varies by agency how much you're selecting on it, but you're always going to be selecting on people who are risk averse. But also you have the structure of people who, because tenure is so valuable, it stretches, and because the university is shrinking, and all of these, we've layered so many functions on it that tuition's going up and all the rest of it. And the administrators will tell you, look, I don't have money to have more tenured faculty. It's not like I did this because I don't like tenured faculty. But that because of that, it takes forever to get through your Ph.D., your postdocs, to get your tenure track job, to go through all of the hoops to get tenure. And by the time you get there, you're just kind of in middle age. And you've got, you have other things to think about than overthrowing the world. And that just having that structure, having the job protections, creating a community of people who are going to be working together for the rest of their lives, that is going to create a dynamic. Where in many ways, it is harder to speak out because you can't go get another job somewhere else.
I mean, I think this cuts both ways. I think there are downsides to tenure, some of which is that it does certainly select for people with risk aversion, although a sort of counter argument to that is like, it's actually very risky to get a PhD because you might not actually get a job. And so you can make the opposite case that these are like risk-oriented people, in fact.
Fair enough.
But I don't discount your point, right? That there are real downsides to tenure. I mean, we see this with people who get tenure and then basically never change their courses for the rest of the 40 years they teach at the institution and never do another minute of work, right? Like, those people exist. Every college has them. But I think when you think about the alternative system, I think other than journalism, academia is one of the only jobs in the country, the business of which, again, is ostensibly truth-telling, right? And if you look at how the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, originally talked about tenure in the early 20th century, one of the things they emphasize is that tenure is for the public good. It protects the public's right and access to information and knowledge produced in conditions of free thought. And the emphasis was on, yes, does tenure ipso facto produce labor protections? Of course it does. But that was a byproduct of a system whose end goal is not labor protection itself, but the securing of public access to knowledge that is freely produced, right? And yes, are there plenty of downsides to tenure? Sure. I agree with many of them. But I think the alternative is a world where institutions hire and fire based on the variable wins, which they already do to a certain extent, but which that gets even more acute. We're in a moment right now where the academic pendulum is kind of swinging back the other way. And the exact same problem is being reproduced, right? I get asked all the time, what do you think about the DEI initiatives to hire conservatives? What do you think about, the civic centers, the anti-Semitism task force, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And it's like, well, any of those things may be fine in a vacuum. I don't think they're bad things per se, but they are leaving the basic set of problems, the festering wound here, which are the labor conditions, right? Completely untouched, right? And we can go from DEI for minorities to DEI for conservatives, and yet we're still not touching the fundamental problems within the financial model. And so could you make the case about tenure that it's not a perfect system? Sure. But what I know certainly is that the system we have, which academics are now mostly the equivalent of Uber drivers, except with the particular misfortune of needing to find a new place, a new state to work in every year or two as they bounce from job to job, that is a hellish drain on the possibility of free thought in this country. So could you imagine better alternatives to the tenure system? Very possibly, but I don't think you could imagine a worse alternative for American intellectual life, at least on college campuses, than what we have right now in the labor system.
Journalism and academia are both tournament industries these days. Journalism didn't used to be, but now it is. And a tournament industry, for listeners who don't know, it's an industry where you have a lot of aspirants and only a few winners, and there only can be a few winners, usually because they pay in something other than money. Right? Like investment banking, it's hard to get into, but if you don't get into investment banking, you don't go off feeling crushed that your dream of making spreadsheets has been killed.
Right.
But if you don't get to be a philosophy professor, or you don't get to be a writer, that's a different kind of, or you don't get to be an actress, it's a different kind of disappointment. And those industries have the characteristic that there are a few winners who do reasonably well. And then there are a lot of losers, and they've always had that characteristic. But the difference between journalism and academia is that it doesn't take you 15 years to find out you're one of the losers. And academia is really, I think, extreme in that way.
Yep.
But I would say that it poisons how faculty see the rest of the world because the jobs are so scarce and because people are so desperate. But could that be different? Right? It is a tournament. Mm-hmm. You could shorten tenure track.
Yep.
You could move some contingent faculty, although I think there is a reason that a lot of faculty are contingent, not in the humanities so much as in there's a lot of room for contingent faculty who are practitioners.
Right, of course.
Or who are just picking up a class here and there.
Right, they teach accounting. They do a class, yeah.
Yeah, there are fine things about that, but it can't, even if you moved some of that, it would still be fundamentally the same, right? There would still be way more people who want to be professors.
Yep.
Than can be.
Well, I think there's ways in which that's true, but I also think, look, what I would point out is that the number of administrators in many elite institutions around the country have nearly doubled in the last 10 years, right? We're seeing explosive administrative bloat. Mostly those are jobs no one can actually explain what these people do. And that aren't directly serving the educational mission in any kind of way. Now, some of those people, I'm sure, are necessary employees, but I don't think a lot of them are. And I don't think you'll find many academics who will say that most of those are necessary employees, right? Because the number of students at most of these institutions has remained stable while the administrators have exploded. And so the question I would ask is, would it not be better to have less administrators, whatever, running student life and organizing volleyball tournaments or whatever they do, And wouldn't it be better to have smaller class sizes and more faculty on campus making those salaries the administrators make? Wouldn't that be better for the students? And the answer is obviously that it would, right? I mean, there's a lot of things you need to do to get academia in a better place. One is mass firings, right? Like there are a lot of people on campus that are lovely people, and this is not a knock against them, but they don't have jobs that matter to the educational mission. And they should go because they are increasing tuition costs or they're diverting resources from people who could serve the educational mission, right? And so I'm not especially I'm just not sympathetic to the argument, well, professors are expensive. It's like, well, administrators are expensive, right? Yeah, you guys have no trouble expanding them. So yeah, I just think, particularly in the AI age, right? I think smaller class sizes, expanded faculty hiring, using that money, again, not to hire staff, but to hire educators. That is something colleges could do if they chose to, but they've instead decided to lean into this model in which colleges are basically, as I call them, luxury experience centers that are glorified theme parks, right? And partly that's because that's what students want, but it's partly because they're locked in an arms race with other theme parks / universities around the country, that you need to get the next remodeled lazy river in order to make sure that you get the right quotient of students, right? But there are things that could be done, but whether universities have the stomach for them, it remains to be seen. And then on top of that, what incentive do they have to change, right? Like we were talking about the crisis of America in higher education. I have to point out, at least at elite institutions, this is not a financial crisis. If you look at Harvard, despite the fact that, this claim that, these institutions are in crisis, their endowment continues to expand, often outperforming expectations, right? And so I just don't think there's a lot of incentive for universities to change while there's still fierce demand for the best schools and the tuition checks are still cashing, right? So why hire more professors? Why fight AI? Why try to make sure the students are illiterate and read if the tuition checks still cash? There's not a lot of pressure for them to do so, other than the right thing, but that's not what universities are really in the business of.
So what should be done instead on affirmative action DEI? Is there a way, in leaving aside the kind of financial problems, some of these administrators are there to solve a problem we feel like should be solved. What would a university that handled these issues well look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are things you can do between fully tipping the scale in an indefensible way in favor of minority candidates and doing nothing. I think a lot of these elite institutions, even as they fancy themselves as very progressive, are overwhelmingly biased toward students coming out of a very narrow bandwidth of Ph.D. programs, right? There are great candidates coming out of state schools. One experience I had, without getting too specific, involved, and it's something I believe I've talked about on social media before, a candidate who was coming out of a state school who had a less than polished DEI statement. And there was another candidate who had a more polished one, but the research was about equal. And I was like, well, the person coming from the elite university, right? They have all this help with how do you write a good DEI statement? The kid coming from the public school that's under-resourced for his PhD program, whose work is good, he doesn't have all that institutional support, right? So I think thinking differently and more holistically about where are we willing to accept PhD students from, I think that helps. Making sure that you are approaching in a way that is as fulsome as possible, that you're not examining candidates through a kind of class bias, which is another real problem, right? It is just the case that a lot of university professors are the children of university professors, not because they're smarter or more talented, but because they have all sorts of insider advantages. They know how to do a job talk. They've seen a million job talks. They've been in a teaching demo before, right? And so I think there's some line of, okay, how do we be aware of biases that we might encounter in hiring? How do we be aware of the way that minority candidates might be disadvantaged when we say we're not willing to look at a state school and we only want to hire from the Ivies, and saying, well, we got to throw all academic standards out the window in order to make sure our campus is browner, blacker, more LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And last question, the one we ask everyone, what are you optimistic about on this issue?
I'm going to say something that sounds apocalyptic, but it is actually it is an expression of optimism. I think we're in a moment where the professional class in this country is getting proletarianized and is downwardly mobile. We have a lot of people who are maybe making okay money, but they were sold this dream that if you do everything right and if you go to college and you work hard, you will do better than your parents, you will own a home, you will afford a car, you can have a family, you can pay for daycare. And there are a lot of people who went to college who those things are not true for. And maybe they're doing okay and they're doing better than the working class, but their dreams have been dashed against the rocks. And I think we have a lot of very, very angry college-educated Americans in this country right now who want profound change to the system that they feel like screwed them, right? They were sold this dream, take out the loans, you'll be able to pay them back. You'll be able to get the house. You'll be able to do that better than your parents did. And I think, look, historically change in this country in moments of extreme inequality has only happened when people got very, very angry, right? And then suddenly the systems change very quick and you get the New Deal or you get other sweeping transformations that make people's lives better. And I think we are approaching rock bottom in a certain kind of way that feels very unsustainable to me. And there's something's going to have to break. And I think it's going to get to a point where either colleges are going to shape up and figure out ways to make themselves more affordable and speak to the needs of the public, or people are going to say, why would I pay $100,000 a year, which is what some institutions are charging, to send my kid to a school that he's going to just cheat his way through with AI and then might not get a job, right? I'm not doing that. And I think that crisis point, that tipping point, is coming a lot sooner than universities imagine, right? I don't know how many more years these places can expect people to keep cashing the tuition checks when everyone's cheating their way through college and not getting jobs, right? And that may mean in the near future, not as many people go to college and some colleges die. That might mean that colleges figure out how to become more affordable for students and deliver an education that is meaningful, that feels like worth the money and effort and time. But I do think I am optimistic that things are so bad, the only direction forward is up. I mean, maybe I'll be surprised and it'll just get even worse. But I have some optimism that we've hit rock bottom. And
so, what was the old Marxist phrase? The only way out is through.
Yes, there you go. Yeah.
So maybe a libertarian and a leftist can agree on at least that much.
Yes.
Which is itself a hopeful sign.
I agree.
Anyway, Tyler Austin Harper, it has been delightful. Thank you so much for being with us.
No, thank you, Megan. It was a pleasure.